So what I want to do today is finish forensics. And by that, all I'm going to do is give brief review of a few other flawed methods. What? Oh, so that means you didn't see this part either. Interesting, because it was showing up back there. So office hours, there'll be a little window around 2 when I'm gone. I'm going to go pick up some produce somewhere. Exam 2 in a week, and quest deadlines we have today and Monday. So, so forensics, we're going to talk about a few other methods, problems with them, and just for reference, not that I'll ask you this, but there's a book called Forensics Under Fire. It's only a few years old. And it goes through all kinds of examples around the world in which bad forensics methods have been applied and led to all kinds of trouble. So if you need a project or a topic for a paper in another course, this could be a fun one. So I think I'm going to talk about four other topics. Fingerprints. Now I'll start with pre-1990, right? So fingerprints have been used since, I don't know, the 19-teens, 1920s. And when I grew up, we just accepted the fact that that was a gold standard for identification. Fingerprints were unique, they could identify people and so on. Turned out that wasn't quite accurate. So I'm going to focus all 4 of these topics on the 4 ideal features of, or features of an ideal method for matching. The first of which is reference database. And up to 1990, it existed, right? The FBI had all these files and such, but it was not really usable. Right? You could not calculate a random match probability because they had no way of screening. Right? They had all these on file, but they didn't have them coded, so you could figure out, okay, you know, out of our 100,000 or how many there were fingerprints, you know, 500 have these characteristics. There were no discrete characteristics for declaring a match. Independent analysis was possible. In theory. But they had no explicit protocol or no uniform protocol for declaring a match. So that meant really independent verification had no meaning. And these topics were debated. There were organizations, probably still are, fingerprint experts, right? People trained to do matches, and they had these big debates about, well, should we have a uniform protocol? And probably for political reasons, they decided not to, right? It's like it was up to the expert in every case, which meant, of course, every person was their own authority. And they resisted the idea of coming up with these protocols. For the most part, there were not publicized proficiency tests until the mid-1990s. So, first of all, if they're voluntary, are they blind? Nope. So they're not. So this is like from the perspective of error rates, you're going to get probably the lowest error rates when they're not blind. And if we've been using the technology since the 20s, why suddenly do proficiency tests become a good idea in the mid-1990s? What's going on, do you think? This was before CSI television shows. So DNA typing had come in about a decade earlier, and it would have been kicking their butts, right? Because suddenly DNA typing, we're talking about universal protocols. We're talking about, being able to do calculations properly, random match probabilities, etc. And so suddenly they're probably finding that they're up against the wall in court because they don't have any of these in place. And what do they find? False positive error rates of at least a few percent. But up to 22%. Right? They're making mistakes all over the place. And so the problem here, the reason that this all happened is because we accept the fact that if you got 10 good prints from a person, you can pretty well tell who they are. You're not going to make too many mistakes. But, criminals don't go out there and intentionally leave samples of all 10 of their digits, right? And you end up with partials. And so, you got half a print there. You're not sure what digit it came from, and you got to match it to something else. And so that's where the problem came in, is that they started saying, well, yeah, we can, even these partials are unique, and turned out they weren't. So largely fixed after the year 2000, and just to reiterate these numbers, there is now a reference database that is searchable. They use discrete characteristics. Which has to do with, there are certain landmarks they use, and they count ridges and things like that. There are now uniform protocols and of course, prints are permanent. Which means that independent verification is possible. I don't know about proficiency tests. But we can assume that they're done. Right? Once there's independent verification possible, like, becomes almost automatic that you do proficiency tests. Here is another method, dog sniffing. And I remember hearing about this when I was your age, probably younger, and thinking, oh yeah, well, dogs, you know, bloodhounds, etc., can track people. They must be able to tell people apart. It never occurred to me to question it. There's no reference database of smells. There could be, but you know, if we can't smell them, we can't really tell whether they're different or not. There are no discrete characteristics. Would we say that characteristics of odors are permanent? I wouldn't think so. Would there be universal protocols or uniform protocols? Well, not unless you can train all dogs to do the same thing. So, no independent verification possible. Proficiency tests, for the most part, were not done. There's an article, actually it's linked now to our homepage on this, that I want to read some excerpts from. So, fake scent tracking dog sends man to prison for 26 years. I realize you aren't going to be able to read anything maybe other than the title if you can read that. Okay, the year is 2009 for this article, right? Keep that in mind for a moment. So it's July 2009. Florida man who was convicted of murder in part because of the work of an allegedly infallible scent tracking dog is free now because the dog and the dog's owner has been exposed as a fraud. Unfortunately, this guy had to spend 26 years in prison. So he was sentenced to life in prison in 1981 for killing a man. And so his conviction was based heavily on a guy named John Preston, who testified in court that he and his scent tracking German Shepherd connected Dylan to the killer's bloody T-shirt. And so DNA testing in 2007 proved that Dylan's DNA did not match the DNA on the killer's shirt. So in 1981, DNA testing wasn't used in criminal investigations, so authorities relied simply on the presumed legendary nose of this German Shepherd. Preston testified, so this is the guy, the dog's owner, testified that his dog had tracked Dylan to a scent to a piece of paper he had touched, and had even tracked Dylan to a room he was in at the courthouse. Preston, the guy with his dog, and his dog had a track record. He had convinced juries more than 100 times of his dog's miraculous talents. In Dylan's case, Preston even told the court that his dog had the ability to track a scent underwater, to smell underwater. Try that sometime when you're in the bathtub and see how well that works. In '84, before Preston was exposed as a fraud, he told ABC News that he believed he was never wrong. Tim McGuire, a dog tracking expert with Florida's Volusia County Sheriff's Department, said it was implausible that a dog could have picked up Dylan's scent back in 1981, 8 days after the murder, and just after a massive hurricane had blown through the area. Sound a little incredible? McGuire viewed videotapes of Preston's dog at work. In the tapes, there are multiple times when the dog urinates on evidence. The dog should work methodically, but McGuire said he did not consider what the dog was doing to be work. Preston was exposed by a Florida judge in '84 who became suspicious of Preston and set up his own test for Harass 2. The dog failed miserably, or terribly, rather. Documents obtained by CNN show he could not even follow his scent for 100 feet. The judge determined that the dog could only track successfully when his handler had advanced knowledge of the case. So what does that mean about, what did the judge set up, in essence, for the dog and his handler in our language? Well, yeah, bias would have been present. What did the judge do? So a proficiency test. So the judge created his own proficiency test, and he made sure it was what? So that blind, right? To avoid the bias. So when this guy's subjected to it, to a blind proficiency test, he fails. Now why? You know, if this guy convinced a jury, 100 different juries of these talents, why was this the first judge to do it? One has to ask. Preston and his four-legged expert were discredited in 1987, but, and this is just like we saw last time in bullet lead analysis, the state of Florida never reviewed cases on which he testified. Nobody ever told Bill Dellin, who sat in prison another 20 years before he ever knew a thing about it. It wasn't until 2006 that he heard Preston was a fake. So you're really on your own in our criminal justice system when they go after you. Another method, hair matching. Discredited in Canada in 2003, later in the US. Although you could have easily had it, there were no reference databases for hairs. Characteristics used were not discrete. There were no protocols for a match. So independent verification not possible. Proficiency tests in the early 1970s. Compare that to this, right? Found error rates. (28% to 68% of the time. Furthermore, different labs made different mistakes, which kind of reinforces what you expect if they're not using the same protocol. So once again, we're seeing that methods are used even when they know that the methods are bogus. my God. That was a joke. Okay, not your world's brightest terrorist. So you just saw an event. I didn't warn you about it. But now you're going to see a lineup. And your goal is to see if you can recognize this individual in the lineup. Now, instructions are important. So one of the cautions that's supposed to be given before every lineup is that you should be aware that the person you saw in the event may not be present in the lineup. So you have to decide that, and then if you think they're there, who is it? So you get to view the lineup multiple times.
This is a good one.
Okay, here we go again.
This is a good one.
Again? No? Okay. Well, do I hear any yeses? Okay. So now we're going to do poll on this. And for some reason, probably because it's a question I used last year, it isn't telling you where to text to, but this is the number you text to. Try and get as many in as we can. Let's go for 70. Interesting. So, the right answer is none. Someone last hour while we're watching the lineup says, can we view the event again? Like that happens in the real world all the time. So let me show you. This is an exercise actually about the importance of instructions. So in one class, I just show the event and I say, here's a lineup, find the person. Give them the same set of choices you have, but there's no instruction in advance to say, you know, maybe the person you saw isn't there, right? This could be true of any lineup. We should always say that. Your class, I made the comment about the person you saw might not be there. What difference does it make? This is 2010. In the blue columns, the class was not told, not warned in advance that the person they saw might not be present. The red column was. Like half the people with that simple instruction, even though you could say it's obvious that the person you saw might not be in the lineup, half the people do the right thing automatically. That's 2010, 2011, pretty much the same. Your class is about the same. I'll post the results. I think it was, I think last hour, 10 out of about 80 chose the not category. In your class, it's close to 50%. So very subtle instruction has a profound effect on misidentification. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised that we misidentify people anyway. But so that's the point of this exercise. It's not necessarily the fallibility of eyewitness identification. It's about how critical the assumptions are in leading us to the right or the wrong conclusion. So eyewitness identification. How does it fare? Well, if you go downtown to identify someone, they'll probably put you in front of a photo catalog. You could consider it a form of a reference database. But it's not quite the same. Anyone want to guess on how it differs? So in a reference database, a true reference database, what are you looking for? What number are you trying to get out? What? Well, or you're at least trying to figure out what fraction of the population matches. When you're, now, I've never been confronted with a photo catalog, but my understanding is they're looking for what? Are they saying, tell me every face in here you think that could be the person you saw? They want one individual, right? Who is it? Right? So if it's a proper reference database, you'd be going through and you'd be picking out, okay, I'm looked at 200 pictures and 4 of them could be the person, right? That would be your random match probability there. But that isn't the way it's used, it's my understanding. And then the rest is, I mean, identification is a problem. We don't use discrete characteristics. Right, so there'll be things, people we know. You can play this game yourself, right? You could say, well, okay, I saw this person today. What color eyes they have? You might remember the hair. They have glasses, earrings on, etc. I remember one time a friend of mine in Australia, we were, I was working with him every day. And one day, so he'd had a beard and a mustache, and one day he shaved his beard, and I came in and looked at him and said, oh, you grew a mustache, right? It's like, you just don't, we don't compartmentalize how we recognize people into these discrete categories. Independent verification. Well, first of all, it's not possible to specify a protocol for memory. Memories are dynamic. not permanent. And of course, we can't revisit it, right? I mean, it's not like we go back and look at the tape again and say, oh, okay, you know, let other people do this. So there's no real hope of this. And now I'm going to come back to one point at the end on this. In terms of proficiency tests, there are consistent failures by normal people in proficiency tests. For 100 years, we have known for a century that we do a sloppy job of this, right? If we don't know the person in advance, recognizing them later is problematic. We now know that the protocol for lineup, including the instructions, is critical. But that still probably doesn't help. And the difficulty is, once you get exposed to someone in a lineup, even if they're not the right person, then you start remembering, that's the person I saw, that's the person I saw, and it gets reinforced. So it's really a problem all the way around. It is the most common cause of wrongful conviction. Now back to 3. Is identification of the same suspect, we'll call it, by multiple witnesses, a form of independent verification. You'd think so, but the reality is no. There are documented cases in which 6 or more eyewitnesses fingered the same person, and it was the wrong one. In fact, often poor resemblance between the true perpetrator and the one identified. What this suggests is that there's a common influence of witnesses that is very powerful. Right? It just shows how susceptible we are. Okay, so that's the end of forensics. we? Fingered. That's pretty good. I figure if I get the first half of the word looking okay, the rest doesn't matter. So this is a new chapter, and it's not in the book. And it's going to be fairly simple. I'm going to deal with it today and Friday, maybe one or two you'll be gone, so make sure that you watch the lecture. I will also try and upload the chapter in a different form that you can access. What? No, some of you might not be here Friday. I will be here Friday. You just dashed everyone's hopes here by posing that question. Did he really say that? Because then everyone could have convinced themselves that I really said I wasn't going to be here Friday, and they would have had a perfect excuse for not showing up. Shame on you. So, the chapter is about where do numbers come from. You could devote a huge chunk of the course to this. I'm only going to touch on a few points. I want you to think about when you hear a number or read a number in the media, where did it come from? What does it mean, etc. And so I'm not going to dissect this into all the nuances it deserves. But there are a few simple points that you can pay attention to figure things out. How problematic are numbers that we read about? I'm going to talk about 4 types of or properties of counts, numbers, data. When you see a number, it might be an actual count. You might be, it might be everything there is to know. It might be an extrapolation of a count on one group or sample to another. What you read, or the number might involve a data conversion and translation so that the raw data don't resemble at all what you're being told. And the last is that it might be made up. The number might be fictitious. And that's much more common than you might think, at least when it comes to the media. So we'll get through 2 of these today, and I'll finish it on Friday. There'll be a video connected with it, and there'll be an audio connected with it on Friday. Actual counts. The easiest to understand. The data presented are all the data gathered and may represent the entire population There's some obvious examples of this. Athletic stats. Right there, we often have everything at our fingertips. We know the team's win-loss records going back through time, number of championships. We know the batters, batting average, runs batted in, etc. These are complete sets of data, and there's no issue with much of anything. Actuarial stats, which could include causes of death, disease rates, etc. Again, we may have these for an entire country. Not perfect, right? But I'm just saying that that's the nature of, in this case, we're sampling, this is everyone as best we can tell. And I guess the census falls under this. So, in theory, the count represents all the possible data, but may be subject to human and technical error, which includes an inadequate protocol. Right, we just may not be able to count everything, but census we know is flawed, but and they've tried to propose methods instead of going through actual counts. Government or people have proposed, let's do estimation procedures, and government won't go for it. They say we want to go with the actual counts, even though we know it's got problems. The last point we'll hit today, extrapolation from one group to another. The examples, polls, right? We take a subset of the population, we make projections based on that to the whole. There are often future forecasts, if you will, based on the past is another form of this. Types of error. These two, I'm just going to say these are obvious from what we've talked about. Bias and sampling error. And human and technical error for the same reason as above. So this stuff is kind of not necessarily that exciting. It's the next two categories that I'm most interested in, and I'll be talking about those Friday.